John Judge. You favor opening the archives. I wonder whether you have any preliminary hypotheses about what would be found there if the archives were opened.
I think more important than what specifically remains in the archives, Norman Mailer compared it to a Mercedes-Benz that's been left, I think he set up in Harlem for 20 years in terms of what we might find. But we do have lists of what was put in, so we can at least compare them to what comes out. But I think what's more important is the principle that this is public information and it belongs to us, the people of the United States, and not to any secret government or intelligence network or any president or any Congress who are merely hired by us to do our bidding anyway. You know, Thomas Jefferson said that given a choice between a government with no newspaper and a newspaper with no government, he'd always choose the latter. Of course, he never had a chance to read the Washington Post or the New York Times, but the principle he was getting at is that democracy doesn't work unless the people are educated. And he said that the final repository, the ultimate repository of all knowledge must rest in the people, and that there's no one else who's good enough or smart enough to invest that control in a truly democratic society. And we call for a full opening of the files, not dribbled out through pre-censorship like Freedom of Information Act documents with pieces missing, not to selected historians or medical experts, not to a special prosecutor or yet another congressional investigation, but to the people themselves. And much of this that we know about the Kennedy case and the evidence of conspiracy comes from the hard work of independent individual investigators whose names are not mentioned in large part in the film. Mae Brussel, Penn Jones, Sylvia Marr, Holcomb Heston, Paris Flamond, and that's only a few. The current researchers, Robert Groden and Philip Melanson, are still continuing to follow the evidence. When that material comes out, they will be extra little pieces in the jigsaw puzzle, in the mosaic. But we've had enough out in these many years to solve the case. There's enough of the picture visible in the record and in the historical view that we've had in order to get at the bottom of it. So I don't see the files ultimately as holding so much of a smoking gun as merely telling us one more time what the government did or didn't find out about the case. I would like to support the film. I think that outside of the films done by Civil War buffs who try to get every uniform and every rifle right, that Oliver Stone has done the most historically accurate work on the Kennedy assassination to date. The reason it struck a nerve is that this is the hidden secret in the American psyche since that day, November 22nd, 63. The American public has known, and in fact I would contend has been told over and over, that there was a conspiracy to kill the President of the United States, that the people who did it got away with it, and that we can't touch them. And I think that that's in large part why so few people vote nowadays. But Stone has gone into that darkness and shone a light and looked at things. And I think the conclusion of his film is right. I think from my own work, I read the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission. You know, Allen Dulles, when he was asked about releasing the evidence by Hale Boggs, said, go ahead and print it, nobody will read it anyway. And unfortunately, especially now in a post-literate generation, Stone's film is about the only thing that will reach youth. There are a few of us who read still, but as you well know, the FBI is trying to get our name from the library. So this has crossed over the line, and it's why it's so disturbing. But let me tell you two stories to end that convinced me that this was not only a conspiracy, but a conspiracy well beyond the capability of any mafia goon, of any CIA schlepper, of any renegade element in the U.S. intelligence, of any oilman with a beef. These are the layers of the onion that were planted at the beginning so we'd never see the core. My mother worked for 30 years altogether, but 25 years for the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Personnel Office of the U.S. Army, directly under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She was the highest paid woman employee of the Pentagon. She was 5 levels above top security. I mentioned to Fletcher Prouty the other day, I work from the bottom up and he works from the top down, and we met at the Joint Chiefs. My mother's job was to project overall national draft call figures 5 years in advance. She had to project an annual national Selective Service call that was right within 100 people either way, 5 years ahead. She knew from those projections and from the information she got that they were withdrawing from Vietnam. And if you want to get hold of the papers that prove Prouty's point, I just got this today at the Government Printing Office, Foreign Relations of the United States, 61 to 63. The State Department papers are released in Volume 4 of the Vietnam series. This is August to December 1963, and the security memoranda are in there to talk about Kennedy's plan. It's been backed up by Arthur Schlesinger, and more recently, yesterday, I believe, or the day before in the New York Times, by Roger Hilsman. He was pulling out. My mother knew that because she had to project those kind of figures. I asked her after she retired, when did they tell you they would escalate in Vietnam? Because she had to be among the first to know. She said late November of '63. I said the last week in November. She said yes, the Monday following the assassination. I said, was this a few more advisors, a change in policy? She said, I couldn't believe the figures. I took them back to the Joint Chiefs in what must have been the first protest by the civilian community to the war in Vietnam and said, these can't be right. And they said, you'll use them. They told her November 25, 1963, that the war in Vietnam would last for 10 years and that 57,000 Americans would die, and to figure that in. I also talked to SAC bomber pilots, Strategic Air Command bomber pilots, who have the responsibility of nuclear and emergency response, who are in the air on regular shifts, 24 hours a day. These were in the air over Wright-Patterson Air Force Base when they heard the news that Kennedy had been shot. They ran to open lockers that contain a cryptographed code book that allows them to tell whether the president is calling them and to take orders that go all the way out to fail-safe and nuclear war. There was not a pilot in the air that hour, over Wright-Pat anyway, and I would contend this is the case everywhere else, no reason to isolate it, that had a code book in that locker. We know from Pierre Salinger's book that there was no code book aboard Air Force Two, bringing the entire cabinet back from important meetings that changed the course in Vietnam in the next few days. They were in the air and had no way to communicate with the White House or the president. There's nobody that can touch those books besides the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the highest levels of defense intelligence. And at every level of my work, the Office of Navy Intelligence is who rears its head on the mechanic level, the Defense Industrial Security Command. This is the background of Oswald and Guy Bannister and Jack Ruby when we go into them. And whatever is in the record will merely back that up. The physical evidence is already in front of us, so we know that one lone nut with an old gun that lost the war for the Italians in World War II, which couldn't even shoot a bullet to line up with its own scope, didn't do the damage in Dallas. But Kennedy wasn't all that was killed that day. Democracy died.